Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and remember, Context is Everything Media Network founder and CEO John Michael is reading another textbook. This one is from the year, you guessed it, 1940. That's right, before we were in World War II, this book was written, and this is a Catholic school American history textbook. And we're on Chapter 8, just starting Chapter 8 today, Chapter 8, Section 1. Inventions to Save Labor. Eli Whitney. Can you imagine a pair of cotton stockings being fit for a queen? That was so in Queen Elizabeth's day. Cotton was rare and expensive in those days. Even after cotton began to be cultivated in America, it continued to be costly. Let us follow the story of the man who changed all this. His name was Eli Whitney, and he was born in Massachusetts. When Eli was young, almost the only thing he knew about was cotton. The only thing he knew about cotton was that it was expensive. A nail maker. Whitney was a boy at the time of the Revolutionary War. While still quite young, he helped to support his family by making nails. He made good nails and easily sold them all. He had a motto. Whatever is worth doing is worth doing well. He probably spoke American, though. Whatever is worth doing is worth doing well. When he went to Yale College, he lived up to this motto. He became known as a good student. After Eli Whitney went to the South traveling by boat, a passenger of the boat, Mrs. Nathaniel Greene, she was a widow of General Nathaniel Greene, who fought so well in the Revolution. When they arrived in Georgia, Mrs. Greene introduced Eli Whitney to her friends. Whitney, in this way, met some of the leading men in the South, the poor conditions of the South. Mrs. Greene gave a party and invited young Whitney. All the men in the party were talking about the bad condition of the South. Everyone agreed that the cotton was hardly worth growing. Whitney could not understand that. He knew that so many people around the world would be glad to get cotton, so that he explained the whole problem to Whitney. Now, folks, remember this book was written in 1940. So what I'm about to read is from 1940. So that's kind of interesting, isn't it? This is a relic of time. The cotton problem. Cotton was grown very easily and very cheaply in the South. There was no problem about that. The trouble was with the cotton seed. Hidden in such a fluffy cotton ball as it grows on the bush are dozens of seeds. Before the cotton lint can be used, the seed must be removed. The work of removing the seed was very slow. Every seed in the ball of cotton, B-O-L-L, had to be removed by hand. This was slow and tedious work. It took a slave a whole day to clean about 1 pound of cotton. If this work could only be done by a machine, then the South would become rich indeed. The cotton gin. Whitney went into the fields for the first time and saw cotton balls. He decided to invent a machine to clean the seeds from the cotton. Eli Whitney shut himself up in a workshop. First, he even had to make the tools he needed. The first 3 months he worked patiently. He had many disappointments. At the end of 3 months, he turned out a real cotton cleaning machine. This machine was invented in 1793. Eli Whitney's machine could remove a day's seeds from many hundreds of pounds of cotton. The machine was called the cotton gin. That is, the cotton engine. The South was delighted with Whitney's invention. Thousands of acres of land were planted in cotton. New fields were quickly covered with white snowballs. Cotton cloth became cheaper, and everybody wanted cotton. The southern planters were becoming very wealthy, growing the cotton to supply the mill. Prosperity had come to the South, but at a terrible price. This price was the spread of slavery. Slavery had begun to die out before the invention of the cotton gin. This machine made cotton king. Thousands of slaves were needed to work on the cotton plantations. Whitney did not grow rich on his invention. Many men used the cotton gin without paying him for his invention. His first machine was even stolen and copied. However, the state of Georgia granted him a sum of money as a reward for the invention of the cotton gin. Later, Whitney got rich by making guns for the government. Whitney was perhaps the first person of the United States to introduce mass production. Each one of his men worked at making a certain part of the gun. Now we're talking about guns. These parts were all interchangeable. That is, the parts were made exactly alike so that any one of them would fit any gun. In that way, the parts could be quickly assembled or put together, and the gun was ready to use. The modern automobile is made along the same plans. Cyrus McCormick. That's a fun name. The staff of life. There is an old and wise saying that bread is the staff of life. It is one of the most important of our foods. Bread is made from flour, and flour is made from wheat. Wheat is easy to grow, but in the old days it was difficult to reap or cut. A little over 100 years ago, there lived a Virginia farmer named Robert McCormick. A little over 100 years before 1940, when this book was written. Each year when McCormick's wheat was ripe, he had to cut it with a long carved knife called a scythe. A scythe can cut only a few stalks of wheat at a time. The work was hard, and as a result was only a small amount of grain. Robert McCormick wished he had some sort of big cutting machine. Then he could reap a whole wheat field in a short time. The promise of a reaper. Thinking about a wheat cutting machine led McCormick to start thinking of how to make one. It took some time, but at last he built a reaper that he thought would work. He called together his neighbors and friends. Sad to say, the machine was not a success. Robert McCormick was discouraged and did not try to make another reaper. The McCormick Reaper. What? In 1834, Robert McCormick had a son named Cyrus. Oh. Cyrus began tinkering with his father's machine. Then he put that machine aside and started to build one of his own plan. He worked at the machine for 3 years. Then success came. Cyrus McCormick turned out a machine that would cut the grain evenly. Best of all, very little grain was wasted. It was 9 years before a single reaper was sold. Then better times came. Farmers began to buy McCormick reapers. Other reaping machines had been invented about that time. The farmers liked the McCormick reaper best. Cyrus McCormick was more than an inventor. He was a keen businessman. He looked around for a good place to build his machines. He felt that the level of prairies of the West would, in time, become the great wheat-growing sections of America. So McCormick moved to Chicago in 1847. At that time, Chicago was only a small city. McCormick expected his business to grow with Chicago, And that is exactly what happened. The McCormick Reaper did its part in helping to make America great and rich. We became the greatest wheat-growing country in the world. This could not have happened without a harvesting machine such as Cyrus McCormick invented. Elias Howe, the sewing machine. This is a story of another Yankee inventor. It is a story of another long struggle to win success in the making of a sewing machine. The sewing machine is another labor-saving device, as were the cotton gin and the reaper. They helped the planter and the farmer. The sewing machine is the greatest help to the women of the home and to the workers of the factory. It was invented by Elias Howe. I might be mispronouncing that name. Elias. Elias Howe was born in Massachusetts. His father was a town miller. Elias, the farmers brought their wheat to his mill to be ground into flour. Young Howe had only a few terms in school. He had to go to work. His first job was with his father in the mill. Soon he left home and went to work in the city of Lowell, Massachusetts. Even in those days, Lowell had a number of textile factories or mills. A needed machine. The South sent cotton to Lowell to be spun and woven into cloth. The mills were making plenty of cloth. There was no trouble about making cloth. The trouble was to sew the cloth into clothing. Every stitch of this sewing had to be done by hand. Howe had an idea that there should be a machine to do the sewing. It would be the most important link in the chain of making clothing. Elias Howe began to work on a sewing machine. His tools were poor, and the work was slow. He had a little money and could only work on a new machine now and then. At times Howe almost starved. But he would not give up. At last he made a machine that would really sew. He was granted a patent on the sewing machine in 1845. A patent is an official paper granted by the government. It protects the inventor. A patent gives the inventor the sole right to manufacture and sell the article that was invented. A misunderstood invention. Howe had a sewing machine and a government patent, but did not help him much. This did not help him much. No one would lend him money to make sewing machines which he could sell to other people. The hard-headed businessmen of Boston would have nothing to do with Howe's machine. Elias Howe then went to England, but no one there would take a chance on his invention. To make matters worse, some people began to claim that Howe was not the real inventor of the sewing machine. Howe went to law and proved his rights. Then came the change in his fortunes. Quite suddenly, people seemed to see the enormous value of the sewing machine. A factory was built to make them. Almost everyone wanted a sewing machine. Sewing machines were used in the home and in the factory. They could sew clothes and canvas and all sorts of materials. Soon, an improved machine could stitch even leather. Then cheap boots and shoes could be made. The first sewing machines were run by hand. Then Isaac Singer made a sewing machine with a foot pedal. Modern sewing machines are usually run by electricity. I hope you all have a lovely day. I hope you all have a lovely weekend or a lovely week, a lovely evening, morning, or afternoon, all dependent upon your time watching this video. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. Goodbye.